Imagine if one ship captain had taken a different route. One of history's greatest cities might never have existed. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine stood on the shore of a small Greek fishing village called Byzantium. His decision to move the Roman capital here, on a narrow strip of water between Europe and Asia, created Constantinople, the jewel of the medieval world. But that choice was not random. Constantine built on a decision made centuries earlier, when Greek settlers first recognized that this same peninsula, wrapped on 3 sides by the Bosporus, offered an unbeatable harbor, easy defense, and control over the trade route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That earlier settlement was itself a choice. Each link in the chain narrowed the possibilities until this site became nearly inevitable. Geography gave the options. Human decisions picked the winner, so if geography alone doesn't explain where cities rise, what other factors come into play? Geography is the canvas, but it is not the painter. River crossings, defensible hills, natural harbors, and fertile floodplains are the raw materials. The Tiber Island gave Rome its crossing point. The Seine offered Paris a secure island that became its core. The Thames provided London with a tidal highway into the interior. Without such features, no medieval city could have grown. Yet dozens of river islands, hundreds of hills, and countless harbors dot the map of Europe. Most never became anything. Geography creates possibilities, but it does not dictate which possibility becomes a city. A bridge built here, a harbor dredged there, a wall raised on that hill. Each choice turned a natural advantage into a living settlement. The same riverbank that fed one city remained empty for centuries a few miles away. The canvas is necessary, but it waits for a hand to pick one spot over another. Geography provides the stage, but who makes the first move onto that stage? The first stone is often laid by accident or simple necessity. The first stone is rarely laid with ambition. It is usually a practical, even forgettable choice. A ford where cattle cross, a beach where boats can land, a slope above a floodplain where a few families build huts. Londinium began as exactly that sort of place. Before the Romans arrived, the Thames was crossed by a ford at a spot where the river narrowed and the ground rose on both sides. Traders used it, then a few huts appeared, then a small settlement clustered around the crossing. When the Roman army needed a logistics base and a bridgehead, they chose that spot because the work had already begun. They did not found London from nothing. They adopted a modest cluster of trade and shelter that had already proven itself useful. The same pattern repeated across Europe. The village that became Paris started as a fishing settlement on an island in the Seine. The future Constantinople was a small Greek trading post called Byzantium, named for a mythical founder but built for real ships to dock and trade grain. None of those first inhabitants imagined their village would become a capital. They chose the spot because it worked today. That mundane decision, repeated by anonymous farmers and merchants, laid the foundation for everything that followed. The great chain of decisions begins not with a king's decree, but with someone finding a practical place to spend the night. But the first stone is not always left to anonymous hands. Sometimes a sovereign steps in deliberately, choosing a location for political vision. When a ruler gives the order, the chain of decisions can jump ahead by centuries in a single decree. Charlemagne at Aachen is a clear example. He needed a capital to project his authority across a newly unified empire. He chose a small settlement with hot springs, a former Roman spa. Aachen lay at the crossroads of his realm, close to his ancestral lands, a symbol of permanence and healing. Charlemagne built a palace, a chapel, and a court, making Aachen the heart of his Carolingian Renaissance. Without his personal decision, that modest village would never have become the seat of an emperor. But when his dynasty faded, Aachen faded too. the sovereign's edict can build a city but cannot guarantee its survival. Alfred the Great faced Viking invasions that had destroyed several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. He needed a network of fortified towns for shelter, trade, and resistance. So he created over 30 burhs, each chosen for a defensible hill, a river crossing, or a spot that controlled a road. Some, like Oxford and Cambridge, grew into great cities. Others remained small towns. Alfred's decision was political, not economic, a response to war that reshaped England's geography and laid the foundation for a kingdom that could withstand invasion. These were not mere nudges to existing settlements. They were acts of will that overrode the organic logic of geography and trade. Constantine also made such a choice when he moved his capital to Byzantium, but he built on a Greek trading post. The sovereign's edict requires a seed already planted. Without the royal decree, Byzantium might have remained a modest port. Without Charlemagne, Aachen might have stayed a spa. Without Alfred, many of England's future cities might never have existed. The question is, what happens when a sovereign's vision collides with the forces that actually make a city thrive: trade, convenience, and the decisions of ordinary people? Venice had no emperor or king. No decree ordered a city built there. It began with refugees fleeing barbarian invasions in the 5th century, sheltering on mudflats in a lagoon. The location was terrible. No fresh water, no farmland, no stone, but the lagoon offered protection and access to the sea. That sea became the basis of an economic decision that shaped one of the most powerful cities of the medieval world. Venetian merchants built ships. They traded with Constantinople. They exchanged salt from the lagoon for goods from the east. Every new cargo reinforced the logic of the original location. The city grew not by command, but because each merchant's profit made the next voyage possible. By the 13th century, Venice controlled Mediterranean trade, and its once terrible location became its greatest asset. Bruges followed a similar pattern on land. It sat at a crossroads of northern European trade routes, linking the cloth towns of Flanders with the Hanseatic League and English markets. The Counts of Flanders built a castle, but the real force was the merchants who arrived, built warehouses, and turned a small canal town into a hub for wool, cloth, and money. Bruges became a city that bankers and traders chose, not one that kings commanded. When a sovereign's decree aligns with a merchant's choice, a city can explode. But when they conflict, merchants often find a way to win. Their decisions are not grand pronouncements but countless daily choices. Over decades, those choices create a momentum that no edict can match. The decision to place a church, monastery, or shrine in a particular spot could draw people from across continents and turn a remote village into a thriving city. When Thomas Becket was killed in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, the site became a pilgrimage destination. Pilgrims poured in, and with them came inns, markets, and workshops. The city's economy transformed, and its growth was no longer just about its location on the road from London to the coast. It was about the significance of the event. Santiago de Compostela followed a similar pattern. According to tradition, the remains of the Apostle James were discovered there in the 9th century. The route to Santiago, the Camino, became one of the great pilgrimage highways of Europe. Towns sprang up along the way, each one a decision made by someone who saw an opportunity to serve the pilgrims. The city of Santiago itself became a medieval metropolis, not because of a harbor or a river crossing, but because of a tomb. Monasteries functioned similarly. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, founded by an Irish monk, grew into a town with a famous library and scriptorium. Monte Cassino in Italy, the mother house of the Benedictine order, attracted not just monks but settlers who needed protection and community. In each case, a religious decision created a gravitational pull that reshaped the landscape. But what happens when faith alone cannot guarantee safety? When pilgrims become targets and the sacred site needs walls to survive, the sacred site needed walls to survive. Where to put them became a decision that could override all others. Hilltop towns like Carcassonne in southern France occupy rocky plateaus, their walls giving defenders clear sight lines and attackers steep, punishing slopes. San Gimignano in Tuscany went further. Its towers doubled as watchposts and defensive redoubts, turning the skyline into a fortress. Island sites took the logic to its extreme. Mont Saint-Michel rises from a tidal basin, accessible only at low tide, letting a small garrison hold off a large army. Venice was built on a lagoon for the same reason. Its founders traded farmland for security, forcing every supply to come by boat. Border towns faced a different calculus. Berwick-upon-Tweed on the English-Scottish frontier was fortified more than a dozen times, its strategic location making it a perpetual target that drained resources and stunted economic growth. Frontier settlements across the Holy Roman Empire often relied on a lord's castle perched on a remote crag, but that isolation kept them small and poor. The trade-offs were real. Defensible hills made transport difficult. Island sites required importing water and firewood. The most secure locations were often the least convenient for commerce. And here the complication emerges. A wise defensive decision in one century could become a liability in the next. A wall that stopped a Viking fleet was useless against cannon. A hilltop that favored archers left no flat land for trade. Every choice had a cost visible only in hindsight. Even the best defenses cannot guarantee survival if the original decision was flawed. That brings us to the role of chance. Sometimes the founding event was not a deliberate choice but an accident. Bruges today is known for canals and cloth markets, but its rise began with a storm. In the 11th century, a powerful North Sea surge broke through the coastal dunes and carved a new inlet called the Zwin. The small settlement on a sluggish river suddenly found itself connected to the open ocean. Ships could now reach its wharves directly. That accidental breach turned a minor agricultural village into a gateway for the Hanseatic trade network. No ruler decreed it, no merchant calculated it. A weather event rewrote the geography and set off a chain of investment, walls, market halls, and eventually the wealth that made Bruges one of Europe's great medieval cities. Its location became perfect only because nature had thrown the dice. For every capital chosen by a king's decree, there is a Bruges that exists because a wave broke in the right place. Around 660 BC, Greek settlers from Megara chose the triangular promontory at the mouth of the Bosphorus for a colony. They saw a deep natural harbor, a defensible headland, and a passage connecting the Black Sea to the Aegean. That decision gave Byzantium its first stone. For nearly 1,000 years, Byzantium remained a middling Greek town. In AD 324, the Roman Emperor Constantine stood on the same promontory. He needed a new capital, one far from a hostile senate and pagan traditions, closer to the empire's frontiers. He considered Troy and Sirmium but chose Byzantium. The location offered a defensible peninsula, superb harbor, and command of the land route between Europe and Asia, and the sea route between the Mediterranean and Black Sea. He expanded the walls, built a forum, hippodrome, and palace, and renamed it Constantinople. That single decision triggered a cascade. The city's defensible position led to the Theodosian walls in the 5th century, a triple line of fortifications that repelled every attacking army for 1,000 years. Safety attracted merchants from across Eurasia, silk from China, furs from Russia, spices from India, slaves from the north. Constantinople became the richest city in Christendom. After the Nika riots burned half the city, Emperor Justinian rebuilt with unmatched ambition, commissioning Hagia Sophia, a structure so audacious contemporaries believed it was held up by divine power. That made Constantinople a sacred pilgrimage destination for Orthodox Christians. Each decision, walls, trade, religion, compounded on the last. In 1204, Crusaders sacked the city, shattering it and breaking the chain for 6 decades. The Byzantines restored it in 1261, but the empire was poorer and more defensive. In 1453, Ottoman Sultan Mehmed Roman II looked at the same waters and refused to accept the city as impregnable. He dragged his fleet overland, blasted holes in the Theodosian walls with cannon, and took the city. He made it his capital, converted Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and renamed it Istanbul. The chain did not snap, it changed hands. Each ruler built on the same foundations: the harbor, the straits, the promontory. Constantinople's chain runs from the first Megarian settlers to the Ottoman sultans and beyond. What if Constantine had chosen Troy? What if the Fourth Crusade had never sailed? What if Mehmed had failed? The chain would have led somewhere else entirely. That same principle applies in a very different way to Paris. Here, the chain was not forged by a single edict but assembled decision by decision over more than 1,000 years. Around 250 BC, the Parisii, a Celtic tribe, chose the Isle de la Cite, an island in the Seine, as their settlement. The island gave them natural defense and control of the river crossing. It was a practical choice, not a prophecy of future greatness. When the Romans conquered the area in 52 BC, they built a town they called Lutetia. They spread onto the left bank, constructing forums, baths, and an amphitheater. But the island remained the heart of administration. The Roman decision was to treat it as a provincial hub, nothing more. Then came the 3rd century invasions. The empire contracting, the left bank was abandoned. The city retreated to the defensive island. That decision to pull back onto the island preserved the settlement when many others were wiped out. In the early 6th century, Clovis, king of the Franks, converted to Christianity and made Paris his capital. Why Paris? Because it held the tomb of Saint Genevieve, the city's patron, and it carried the prestige of Roman authority. It was a political and religious decision, not a geographic one. For centuries afterward, the Merovingian and Carolingian rulers rarely stayed in Paris. The city remained a minor seat. The decisive branch came in 987 when Hugh Capet was elected king of the Franks. He was Count of Paris. He chose to rule from the city on the island. That single choice turned Paris from a symbolic capital into an actual one. Every subsequent Capetian king made the same decision: stay in Paris. Philip Augustus in the late 12th century built the Louvre fortress, paved streets, erected new walls. He turned the city into a fortified administrative center. The University of Paris drew scholars from across Europe. Notre Dame began rising on the island's eastern tip. Each of these decisions was a reaffirmation. Clovis could have chosen Soissons or Reims. Hugh Capet could have remained at Orleans. Philip Augustus could have built a new palace elsewhere. But step by step, they reinforced the same spot. The concrete discovery is this: Paris did not become great because geography destined it. Geography gave the island, but it was human choices, repeated across centuries, that made Paris a capital. The chain shows that political reaffirmation, not a single dramatic moment, can build a city just as powerfully. The decision to keep ruling from the same island, again and again, is what turned a modest river town into one of Europe's enduring centers. London starts like many Roman foundations. Around 50 AD, the Romans built a bridge across the Thames and established a trading settlement they called Londinium. The location was practical, a place where the river narrows, easy to cross, accessible to the sea. Within decades, it became the provincial capital, a bustling port with a forum, a governor's palace, a fort. For 3 centuries, that chain held. Then the Romans left. The legions withdrew in the early 5th century, and the administrative structure collapsed. Londinium's population dwindled, the port silted up, the buildings crumbled. By the 7th century, the once great city was essentially abandoned, a ghost town of overgrown ruins. The chain had snapped, a different decision, and London might have become nothing more than a footnote. The revival came from an unlikely source. In the late 9th century, King Alfred the Great was fighting a desperate war against Viking invaders. He needed fortified towns, burhs, to defend his kingdom of Wessex. One of those burhs was placed on the site of the old Roman city. Alfred's decision was not about trade or prestige, it was military necessity. He ordered the repair of the Roman walls, the reoccupation of the streets, the resettlement of people. London was reborn not as a capital, but as a fortress. The chain was reforged, and once it was, subsequent decisions built on it. Alfred's successors made London their administrative center. The city grew again as a port, a market, a place of royal authority. Then came the Norman conquest in 1066. William the Conqueror understood that to hold England, he had to hold London. He built the Tower of London on the eastern edge, a stone statement of power. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey, which became the coronation site. London was no longer a revived fortress. It was the permanent seat of royal ceremony and governance. The missing link had been repaired, but not every chain held. In Roman Britain, the first capital was not London but Camulogenum, modern Colchester. It had a temple to the divine Claudius, a theatre, a forum. It looked like the future. When the Iceni rebellion under Boudicca burned it to the ground in AD 60, the Romans rebuilt London instead because its river access was better for trade and supply. Camulogenum never recovered. It shrank to a village while London grew into a metropolis. One decision, made under the smoke of revolt, sealed that fate. Then there are the planned towns that never took off. In the 13th century, English and French kings founded bastides, new towns with orderly grid layouts, market squares, and tax exemptions. Hundreds were built, most remained tiny villages or vanished entirely. They had geography, planning, royal backing, everything except a reason for people to stay. Without an economic or social chain to anchor them, they were ghosts from the start. Or consider Bruges. It had a harbor, cloth trade, banking. But by the 15th century, the Zwin Channel that connected it to the sea kept silting up. Ships could not reach the city. The merchants moved to Antwerp. Bruges did not disappear, but it became a museum of its former self. The chain's later links had been broken. But even the most successful cities faced watershed moments, specific decisions that created an irreversible advantage. Venice and Amsterdam each faced a watershed moment when a single early decision locked in an irreversible advantage. In the 5th century, refugees fleeing barbarian armies settled the marshy islands of a coastal lagoon. They chose not to return to the mainland. Instead, they built canals instead of roads, boats at every door. That choice turned the lagoon's greatest weakness into unmatched strength. By the 10th century, Venice could launch a fleet from its doorstep. By the 13th, it controlled the Adriatic. The entire maritime empire grew from that early decision to embrace the water. Amsterdam began in the late 12th century with a dam on the Amstel River. The dam created a harbor sheltered from the North Sea. In the 1370s, toll rights attracted merchants from across Europe. A century later, city rulers dug a canal system linking the dam directly to the sea, bypassing the treacherous Zuiderzee. That engineering decision turned a local port into the hub of the Baltic grain trade. The dam was the first stone, toll rights were permission, the canal system was the accelerator. Each built on the last, and the first two were made when Amsterdam was barely a village. What makes these decisions watersheds is their timing. Venice chose canals before anyone else. Amsterdam chose infrastructure before its rivals. Once the pattern was set, it became harder and harder to change direction. The advantage locked in. Each early decision created a multiplier effect, and each new decision built on previous gains. Once a city had that first lock-in, a dam, a toll right, a defensive wall, every subsequent infrastructure decision became an accelerant. Build a market square and more traders come. Build a guild hall and craftsmen invest. Build a stone bridge and the opposite bank suddenly becomes developable. Each addition makes the city more central, harder to bypass, and more difficult for any single decision maker to abandon. Florence illustrates this beautifully. In 1345, the city replaced an older wooden bridge with the Ponte Vecchio, but they made a crucial choice. They built shops directly onto the bridge. That decision turned a crossing into a commercial hub. Butchers, then goldsmiths, then bankers clustered there. The bridge became a literal marketplace linking two halves of the city. With each generation, more guild halls rose, walls expanded, and the riverbanks filled with palaces. By 1400, Florence was not just a city, it was an economic machine whose parts reinforced each other. That is the multiplier. A single infrastructure choice rarely transforms a settlement on its own. But when followed by complementing decisions, a port here, a market there, a wall around both, the sum becomes far greater than the individual parts. The city grows not because one ruler was brilliant, but because dozens of smaller choices kept compounding. Yet if growth compounds so powerfully, what happens when those choices point in the wrong direction? When a canal silts up or a bridge leads into a flood zone? That question leads to the other side of the multiplier, the unseen costs tucked inside every decision. That compounding effect is real, but it assumes the chain keeps adding links in the same direction. Political decisions can snap the chain entirely. A ruler decides to move his court, grant a charter, or punish a rebellious town, and a city that seemed unshakable finds itself sidelined almost overnight. Take Paris and Versailles. By the late 17th century, Paris was the unquestioned heart of France. Then Louis XIV decided to build a new palace at Versailles, 12 miles southwest. It wasn't just a residence, he moved the entire government there. Nobles, ministers, diplomats, all of them had to abandon the Louvre and the Tuileries and relocate to a purpose-built town in the swampy woods. Paris did not collapse, it remained the economic capital, but for almost a century the political center of gravity shifted to Versailles. That one decision, born of the king's personal preference and distrust of the Parisian mob, deliberately weakened the city's political centrality. The decision chain that had made Paris the capital of France, Clovis, Hugh Capet, generations of building, had a new link inserted that redirected power elsewhere. The opposite happened in Prague. In the mid-14th century, Charles IV, King of Bohemia and soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, chose Prague as his imperial capital. He founded a university, built a stone bridge, constructed the Cathedral of St. Vitus on the hill. Those were infrastructure decisions, but the foundational choice was political. Charles could have ruled from anywhere. He chose Prague because it was the seat of his power base, and his decision elevated a provincial town into the political and cultural heart of Central Europe for generations. But political favor is fickle. A city that backs the losing side in a war or a succession crisis can have its privileges revoked, its walls dismantled, its merchants expelled. The same royal hand that granted a city its charter could, a generation later, rescind it. That is the complication. Later political decisions can either magnify a city's fortunes or shatter the chain that earlier generations built. And when that happens, the city is left to rely on whatever other advantages remain, its geography, its trade, its stubborn inhabitants. But when political favor is withdrawn, a city is not necessarily doomed. Human ingenuity, applied at the right moment, can unlock possibilities the geography alone never suggested. Consider Venice. The lagoon was a swamp, an impossible place to build a city of stone. Yet the Venetians drove millions of wooden piles into the mud, created a stable foundation, and erected a city that would command the Adriatic. That was a technological decision. To invest in engineering rather than abandon the site. Similarly, in the Low Countries, the decision to build dikes and windmills allowed cities like Leiden to thrive on land that was literally below sea level, land that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. And improved fortifications in the later Middle Ages enabled cities to expand from cramped hilltops onto the surrounding plains, because they could now defend a larger perimeter. These technological decisions did not erase geography, but they radically expanded the set of viable locations. They are the clearest proof that a city's fate is never sealed by its physical setting alone. But even ingenious technology is only one piece of a larger puzzle. No city exists in isolation, and decisions in one shaped the fate of another in ways no ruler could control. This is where individual chains intersect into networks of mutual benefit or rivalry that could break a city. Consider the Hanseatic League. In the 13th century, Lübeck's merchants negotiated tax exemptions with local rulers and allied with Hamburg. That cooperation grew into a league of nearly 200 cities from Novgorod to London, where sharing privileges meant every member benefited. Danzig, Riga, and Bergen, none naturally dominant, rose to prominence through that access. A single decision to cooperate multiplied the chain, but competition can be destructive. In Italy, the Pisa-Florence rivalry reshaped entire economies. Pisa controlled the Arno's mouth. Florence, landlocked, invested in its own fleet and conquered Pisa's harbor. That broke Pisa's chain and fed Florence's growth, one city's triumph, another's decline. And wars, a single siege or broken alliance could reroute a city's fortunes. The Hanseatic League turned against its own member Bruges over a trade dispute. The League shifted its staple market to Antwerp, starving Bruges of its lifeblood. A decision by many cities destroyed a former partner. If one alliance can lift a dozen cities and one rivalry break a maritime republic, what happens when the whole system shifts? What new intersection is waiting to rewrite the next city's story? But the story doesn't end with the visible battles and alliances. Every decision to build in a certain place also carried hidden costs that only revealed themselves later. Constantinople, for all its splendid seawalls and the Golden Horn chain, was vulnerable from the land. The city sat on a triangular peninsula, defended on three sides by water, but the fourth side was open plain. That one geographic compromise meant that every major siege, from the Avars to the Fourth Crusade to the Ottoman conquest, came from exactly the same direction. The sea was a gift, but it could not protect the landward approach. Bruges, too, paid a price for its early success. The merchants who dug canals and built the Zwin Channel to keep the sea connected made decisions that seemed brilliant at the time. But they failed to manage the silting properly, and over decades the harbor slowly filled with sediment. By the 15th century, even the most determined dredging could not keep the ships coming. The same river that had made Bruges rich became the instrument of its slow decline. London's decision to build in wood rather than stone also came with a hidden cost, a bill that was presented in September 1666. The Great Fire was not a natural disaster. It was a consequence of the material choice made generations earlier. The narrow streets and timber buildings turned a small bakery blaze into an inferno that consumed most of the city. These unseen costs remind us that no decision comes without a price, and sometimes the price is paid in ways no one predicted, turning yesterday's brilliant choice into tomorrow's vulnerability. The same chains of decisions that created vulnerabilities also left behind a structure that outlasted the medieval world. The choices made by medieval rulers, merchants, and builders sculpted the form cities would take for centuries. Walk through the center of nearly any European city today, and you are walking through a medieval decision. The narrow, winding streets of Paris, the irregular block pattern of London's square mile, the radial layout of some Italian town squares all trace back to some moment when a path was chosen, a wall was built, or a market was sited. Those choices became permanent because every later decision had to work around them. London's position as a global financial center did not begin in the 19th century, but grew from decisions made at medieval trade fairs, from the wool merchants who chose to bank in Lombard Street, from the guilds that regulated exchange. The same holds for Frankfurt, for Bruges in its prime, and for Venice. Modern capital flows still follow routes carved out 800 years ago. The cultural identity stamped onto cities by medieval decisions is just as enduring. The decision to build a cathedral in Chartres, Canterbury, or Santiago de Compostela did not just attract pilgrims in the Middle Ages. It made those cities spiritual landmarks that still define their character today. Millions of visitors still walk the Camino to Santiago, still stand beneath the spire of Canterbury. The building is a decision preserved in stone, still drawing people long after the original reasons faded. Great cities are not accidents of history but the accumulated result of countless decisions, each one a branch point that could have led elsewhere. Their foundations teach us that the most consequential choices are often the early ones, made under uncertainty and without knowledge of the future's verdict. Every great city we have traced tells the same story. The chain of decisions is never random and never inevitable. It is a sequence of human choices. The geography was always waiting, but it was the decisions that activated it. A ruler's ambition, a merchant's calculation, a refugee's desperate search for safety, a builder's gamble on a new technology. Those are the forces that turned a patch of ground into a world capital. The medieval foundations teach us that the most consequential choices are the early ones. The Greek colonists who built a trading post on the Bosporus had no idea it would become Constantinople. The Parisii who chose an island in the Seine could not foresee Notre Dame or the Louvre. They simply made the best decision they could with the information they had, and that decision became the first link in a chain stretching across centuries. That thread is still being spun today. If you could go back in time and change one decision that affected a city's location, which city would you choose and why? If you love deep dives into history's hidden patterns, subscribe to see more stories of human decisions that shaped our world.